Okay, great. My name is Chaowei Zhu, and I teach at the Interpreting Translation Studies program at Wake Forest University. The original host, original chair, Dr. Liu, she's not able to make it today due to a schedule conflict, so I will be here. So I have the privilege to be the chair for this session. And this session the theme is trans creation and adaptation. And we have a variety of topics ranging from translation of a humanitarian crisis, materials in Palestine, to translation of women's literature in contemporary China, and to video and audio translation of Disney animated movies. And our three presenters will use very different translation strategies, including intersemiotic translation, discursive reconstruction, and textless back translation. So I guarantee you this will be a very interesting learning experience for us all. And our first presenter today, pardon me if I pronounce your name wrong, is Bushra Kalak. She is a third-year PhD candidate at the Center for Translation and Interpreting at Queen's University, Belfast. Her research interests focus on visualization of meaning as a form of intersemiotic translation, and is especially engaged with human rights discourse and investigates how civil society activists utilize visual narratives to tell stories about the human rights violation in Palestine. She's also had years of teaching experience at different levels of education in different countries. Before I give the floor to Bushra, let me remind you briefly the rules for this session, and I will let you know if you only have 3 minutes left. So I will jump in and remind you. And after presentation, we will have 5 minutes for question and answer. Now, sometimes I know people want to ask more questions, and I will leave my email address there. Or Bushra, feel free to leave your email address there. And you can either email her or you can email me. I can relay the question, or you can just ask her directly in private message. And I also would like to remind you that this session is live streamed on Zoom, YouTube, Blibli, and Douyu. So we will have more audience than it shows up here on Zoom. So without further ado, and let's get started. Bushra, the floor is yours. Bushra, you need to unmute yourself. Hold on.
Yeah, sorry, I missed where the button is. Thank you, Dr. Chawi. You said my name correctly. I hope I'm saying yours correctly. Just let me know you can hear me clearly. Yeah? Okay, great. So welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today. Thank you for the organizers for this opportunity to present at this great conference. I'm happy to be here with you. And as the title of my presentation before you says, visualizing is one way of translating. In my research, I am concerned with how this serves human rights activists in their role as storytellers. So I will explore how they transform words, ideas, or statistics on human rights issues into static or interactive infographics using various meaning-making semiotic cues. To investigate this translation between modes of communication, I will combine principles of the narrative theory as applied in translation studies with visual analysis and investigate specifically how infographics can tell visual narratives that document violations of human rights. By the year 1948, human rights have become instituted in what the United Nations called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a milestone document that came after world wars and their atrocities, and aimed at recognizing a set of equal and inalienable rights to all human beings. Since then, the civil society has taken this declaration as a constitution to guide the documentation of the violations that are witnessed. To achieve this, fieldwork and data collection come at the heart of activism for human rights as a disciplinary narrative. And the outcome could go out to the world in the form of stories. The narrators here are the non-governmental organizations that operate on the ground through representatives to gather information, collaborate with other bodies, and visualize the findings to mobilize people to take action. In the context of this research, I will explore how advocacy for the human rights of the Palestinians is vocalized in the infographics published by Visualizing Palestine, a grassroots organization that strives to narrate a data-driven narrative on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. While Palestine is synonymous for far-reaching violations of human rights, I will focus on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza as an example. Excuse me. Known as the world's biggest open-air prison, Gaza is an enclave city on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This Palestinian city was occupied by Israel in 1967. In 2005, Israel disengaged from the Strip only to impose an illegal blockade on it 2 years later. I chose this specific case due to its significance in understanding human rights narratives in Palestine and due to the gravity of the living conditions there, creating more complexity to construct the visual narratives. I collected 19 infographics on different violations, and to better understand the human suffering in Gaza, the narratives are thematically framed within the siege that has been in place since 2007 and the repeated offensives. The question that leads the discussion is centered on the means an infographic can encapsulate the depth of the tragedy visually, aided by numerical data with the purpose of generating an effective response from the viewers. In this regard, Jacobson's widely cited essay on linguistic aspects of translation highlighted the transformation that happens when translating from one semiotic mode into another, using the word transmutation to describe it. The question here, though, is about the complexity behind using the word translation itself. So, is it rendering the documented human suffering into reports and data in different languages? Or is it interpreting these into visually appealing graphics that enliven the narrative behind them? Or is it building cohesive connections between written texts and images, which Leo and O'Halloran identified as intersemiotic texture, by which an image complements the meaning expressed in a written text, or adds meaning that is independent from it? Or is it adding an interactive element to the infographics, whereby the viewer becomes engaged in constructing the narrative? Or is it all of them? We therefore contend that infographics as visual narratives of human suffering include all these translational actions to narrate and create meaning within a disciplinarily and organizationally framed narrative. To simplify what infographics do in this context, think if you are given the choice between reading through the listed reports from different sources on the left in order to learn about food insecurity in Gaza, or viewing it in the information graphic on the right. Which option would you take? Assumingly, people will be more inclined to learn through the infographic to the right at first, then probably visit the other one for more details. Studies have asserted the persuasive potential of infographics in different contexts. So an infographic is characterized by illustration, large typography, and long vertical orientation displaying an assortment of facts. Interestingly, infographics started in business-related contexts and are designed to appeal to the viewers. help them comprehend a message and retain knowledge. To achieve this, there are two approaches. The explorative infographic, which encourages the viewer to explore and extract his or her own insights through minimally introduced data, like this infographic on ceasefire violations. And the narrative infographic, which prescribes the intended conclusion to the viewer through visually engaging features, like the bold title or graphic imagery in this infographic, informing the viewer about Israel's permit denial to leave Gaza for medical training, thus telling about a violation of health-related human rights. Intersemiotic translation allows activists a set of options to vocalize, or more accurately, visualize their advocacy in infographics. Narratively, this is executed via many strategies and choices, some of which are exemplified in our selected infographics. The viewer learns the narrative through meaning-making intersemiotic cues, like visual paradox, that is achieved by contrasting two elements in the narrative: color correspondence between important parts in the narrative, and visually salient elements that catch attention to deliver the message. These cues could occur together in one infographic. For instance, visual paradox could be achieved by making the paradoxical element salient. More details to come in the discussion next. It is important to note here that the verbal and the visual in our infographics express meaning in conjunction with each other. In other words, they are cases of intersemiotic complementarity. From a narrative perspective, telling a story via an image with a caption only could compromise its significance or demand more effort from the viewer to collect fragmented pieces to build the narrative. Infographics save the viewer this effort by integrating the verbal and the visual in an expressive semantic relationship that relays the narrative. In this first example, photographic imagery from Gaza after the 2014 military assault communicate meanings of destruction, homelessness, and death, with alternating photographs of damaged or destroyed ambulances, schools and homes, and homeless and dead children. The organization states in the description of this visual that it aims to highlight not only the indiscriminate tactics employed by Israel and their impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure, but also the impunity granted to Israel for its violation of international law. Therefore, it contrasts the image with the word. No crime happened here is salient in bright green bold font and a location marker. The informative part appears as the images alternate with statistics documenting the damage, again in contrast with the title, which creates a textual paradox as well. We can also see a quote stating that the United Nations Human Rights Council, that the United Nations Human Rights Council independent commission is concerned about Israel's violations of laws and its impunity. Its repetition with all the images implies the organization's attempt to ridicule the redundancy of such statements and their futility at holding anyone accountable, in contrast with the scale of the destruction on the ground. When put together, these verbal and visual elements communicate the narrative about the event, as well as the organization's stance from the international community's response to it. In this infographic on trauma, the drawing features a long twisted arm with palms at both ends, a visual metaphor for the saving hands of doctors.
Bushra, I'm sorry to interrupt. You have 3 more minutes left.
No worries, okay. The palm to the left illustrates the job done by Palestinian paramedics, treating victims via the visual cues of the bag with a cross, a statistic, and a text explaining it. And the one on the right is meant to show the life threats that they face while doing their job via the cut, drops of blood, and the text in red explaining it. And the narrative here is understood as the viewer connects the red-colored part of the title with the numbers of health workers who died or got injured. Red as a color here functions narratively to tell about casualties, which is also visually bound with the drops of blood. These meanings are also connected with the specific event in which they occurred. Gaza's Great March of Return, when refugees marched near Gaza's borders in protest of Israel's unlawful blockade. Interlingually, there is a misfortunate turn whereby wrong directionality obliterates the flow of the visual narrative. The translations in Arabic and Hebrew fail to start from right to left, which is the direction these two languages follow to read. And this puts the end of the narrative first, thus compromising how the narrative is intentionally structured to first highlight health workers' important role at treating a besieged, repeatedly bombed population. This is meant to show the tragic setting where they operate so that victimizing them stands out as an aggravation of the violations of human rights. Lastly, realism is unavoidable when structuring infographics for advocacy. And what I mean by this is verifiably visual documentation. In this one, which also documents the disparity between the numbers of casualties and those held responsible for inflicting them, a big zero in red narrates the numbers narrates the story as it encircles a photograph of the bombings, easily found on the BBC's website reporting the 2014 offensive. It might also be intended to communicate meanings relating to the siege, thus painting a desperate image of the city being bombed while its population is confined inside an inescapable prison. Thinking about non-governmental organizations, their use of infographics goes in line with their purpose to mobilize the audience to take action. This is where they share some business-like principles, especially that they brand themselves using logos, about pages, press releases, annual reports, and other means to express their identity and the narrative they adopt in relation to human rights issues. With the valuable addition that infographics bring to activist storytelling, their translation across languages and modalities still needs further investigation, particularly because translation practice is voluntary and is yet to be professionalized in the work of such organizations. And that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Great timing. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. This is quite very, very intriguing to me because I never thought you can use these graphics to enhance the expression, the power of translation. So before I open the floor for, but I want to leave the chance to other audience to see if they have any questions before I ask them. I have so many questions.
Sure.
Okay, while we are waiting, I think my first question is, hold on, let's see. The new tragedy of translators. You know, because the way I'm doing when I'm translating, I try to stay neutral. And so in this case, because I know you are like focusing on us, like in many ways, very extreme case, the Gaza. But let's say if I'm from the third party and I'm like coming to translate all these materials, and they will come with the issue that the graphics I'm choosing will actually manipulate the emotion aroused among the readers. So have you ever thought about this, like when you are researching on the transmutation? What kind of measures can you take to in terms of information manipulation? What kind of measures, preventions should we take?
Thank you for the question, and I'm glad that you engaged with the visuals. Let me tell you about one thing I did while conducting this analysis. I shared some of the visuals with some of my colleagues speaking different languages. So I had friends speaking Spanish, Chinese, Italian. I showed them some of the visuals, and let me tell you that they struggled to understand the message. Let's not forget that these infographics are like just a capsule of information that needs to be understood within the bigger context. So, okay, people hear about Gaza in the news, but probably they don't know the historical events that happened and the things that have led to the current situation. So that's one point. Another point, which is at the heart of my ongoing research, is the cultural aspect of the visual elements. So maybe one of the early arguments was that the visual is a universal language. If I show you a photograph, and then if I speak Arabic and you speak Chinese, you will definitely get the same meaning out of it as I do. But how does that happen when it's something that's drawn by someone or, visualized or turned into a graphic for a specific message or to report on a specific incident? So there's a lot of complexity behind this. That's why I put those organizations, I have defined them as the narrators, and I've done some work just trying to explore the background of those people who are visualizing these, let's say, these violations. So the findings are a little bit limited, probably because it's an ongoing research, and probably because many non-governmental organizations are very difficult to reach and contact. However, some of the findings are interesting. So I learned that many of the people who visualize these things are descendants of refugees. So they have experienced these things firsthand. Some of them come from Gaza or they are still in Gaza. And let's say the designer is, because this Visualizing Palestine as an organization is in Canada. So the designer, for instance, is in Canada, but there are workshops and meetings and gatherings to collect data and information and depend on the narrations of those people experiencing suffering firsthand to do these graphics. But definitely a cross-cultural confusion is going to happen anyway, and that's probably where it's risky sometimes to use these infographics, but at the same time we cannot deny their power at informing the general public about the humanitarian crisis that's happening. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed that you used the BBC's graphics at the time. I think that would be a great strategy, to use like a reliable resource that is kind of like a neutral when it comes to conflicts, because that would be my safe bet there. So this is very interesting.
Yeah, I would probably disagree about, I don't know, any news outlet being neutral.
That is true.
They report, but you need to dig deeper and see the language they use and the angle from which they tell the story. So I would refrain from describing them as neutral and just be cautious. And that's why I've taken just a photograph. So a photograph is something that's taken by someone there and circulated, amongst all the outlets. So yeah, I'll just be cautious with this.
All right, thank you for the explanation. So if you want to share your email address and just okay, let me see here if see Maya has a comment here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Bushra? Yes.
Yes. Do you think there is a way to use them that works best to deliver the meaning, I think, of the message and the desired effect on the audience? If so, do you think that the best thing to do is to take into account all three of the meaning-making cues? Thank you, Maya, for the question. First, let me tell you that those three meaning-making cues are my own interpretation of the strategy. I haven't found this in any book so far, especially that I might be wrong to say that translation studies is still in its infancy when it comes to issues relating to semiotics and how meaning is expressed in visual terms. So I've tried to explain how the meaning is made in these examples. So I use these three ways of describing it. And you might know this also, that the way we explain visual language, let's say, comes from our own language, the verbal or the spoken language. So whatever we do in language, whether it's a metaphor, a paradox, a synonymy, is taken and applied to how meaning is expressed in a visual form. So that's still taking its first step in translation studies. So my ongoing research is trying to establish let's say a language, I don't want to say a language, but some related terminology that we can apply to these means of meaning making. Something that works best. The thing is, if I give you the same, let's say, infographic or the same image, and I look at it and you look at it, believe me, we will come with different meanings, because what is at play here is not just that we use our eyes to look and make meaning. We come with all the baggage that we have, our knowledge, our biases, our background, everything we know comes into the scene when we try to make meaning of something visual. So whether it's best or not, I can't say it's the best way, but I can say that we can at least describe how translation issues can be avoided. So like the example I mentioned with the directionality, whereby the graphic designer did not think of this as an obstacle in making meaning for people speaking Arabic or Hebrew. So they just kept the visual as it is. However, it's an important element of the visual narratives. But very stimulating points to think about.
Okay, thank you so much for all the explanation, all your answers. Now, if any of you are interested in intersemiotic translation, you can contact Bushra after this. Yeah. And thank you again, Bushra, for this interesting presentation. Now, due to the time limit, we have to move on to the second one. The second presenter today is Dongyi Jia, and she is a PhD candidate in translation studies at the University of Edinburgh. She holds an MA in translation studies from the University College London. Her current research focuses on translation of contemporary Chinese women's literature. And in today's presentation, she will use Shen Keyi's novel Northern Girls as a case study. Now, Yijia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Professor Zhu, for the introduction. And so I'm happy to be here, and thanks everyone for coming. And the topic of my presentation is Discursive Reconstruction of Gender and Power, Chinese Subaltern Women in Translation. The object of this study is how the discursive subject of Chinese subaltern women is reconstructed through literary translation. And the social historical context is the modernization, urbanization, and industrialization process of post-socialist China, which reached its rapid development after the market-driven national reform in the 1990s. And in this context, the subject formation of the group of female migrant workers becomes a crucial embodiment of Chinese subalternity that is constructed by the class, gender, and rural-urban disparity. And moving from rural areas, these subaltern women work as floating population in big cities, and they have experienced labor exploitation caused by both state socialism and transnational capitalism, as well as a gendered framework of regulatory forces generated by patriarchal framework. So they are enmeshed in multiple power relations, and as a group of large population, their voices are actually largely silenced and marginalized in the public discourse. And in the literary narrative of gendered subalternity, mobility and sexuality are two themes significant for the subject formation process. And with a gendered perspective, some female subaltern writings present an autonomous and resistant female agency that is distinct from the image of subaltern women in public discourse. And in this study, I regard the translation of Chinese female subaltern writing as a transcultural flow between Western and indigenous Chinese feminisms. And based on Foucault's theory of discourse and power and Whedon's framework of feminist analysis, I regard translation as a discursive field where the female subaltern subject is reconstructed through the rearrangement of power dynamics. So to delve into the literary narrative of rural migrant women's lives in translation, I chose Chinese female author Sheng Keyi's novel 北妹, Northern Girls, as a case study because it's the first novel depicting rural migrant women's lives that has ever been translated and published internationally. And the author Sheng Keyi has a subaltern origin herself, and she has the experience of being a rural migrant worker in Shenzhen before becoming a well-acclaimed writer in Chinese mainstream literary circle. So her writing has a rare insight and vitality and grants the discursive autonomy of the subaltern subject. Northern Girls is her first full-length novel, which was published in 2004, and it quickly made her a critically acclaimed young writer in China. This novel depicts the struggles of a group of migrant workers in Shenzhen, and it presents how these subaltern women struggle against stereotype, prejudice, and marginalization in society, as well as the sexual moral orders in the urban area that regards them as objects of sexual exploitation. This novel is featured with stark realism and provides an incisive critique of perils of modernity for Chinese subaltern women. In terms of style, this writing is infused with sardonic humor, narrative irony, and country dialects. Northern Girls has been translated into 4 languages. The English version was published in 2012, and the second edition in 2016. The Russian version was published in 2016, the Czech version in 2019, and the Polish version was published this year. Besides the translators and the editors, other multiple agents have played a role in the importation process of the translated versions of Northern Girls. The first category is commercial publishers, such as the publisher of the English version, Penguin Books, a major British publishing house, which has divisions all around the world, including China. And the publisher of the Czech version, Verzon, is also a commercial publisher. Comparatively, the publisher of the Polish version, Dialogue Academic Publishing House, belongs to the category of academic publishers, which focuses on publishing books relating to the culture and history of Oriental countries for academic purposes. Besides, a non-profit literary network is also important for importing this Chinese subaltern writing. It's called Paper Republic, a website dedicated to facilitating both literary and publishing connections between China and the rest of the world. It plays a significant role in bringing writers, publishers, and translators together for the promotion of Chinese literature, including this novel. Also, in this case study, literary translation also functions as part of the cultural diplomacy. The Russian version is part of a project initiated by the National Press and Publication Administration of People's Republic of China and the Federal Agency for Press and Mass Media of Russia. This project, as a cooperation, aims for the cultural exchanges between China and Russia as a method of cultural diplomacy, and the literary narrative of Chinese subaltern women became part of this project and as a representative of contemporary Chinese literature. Now let's have a look at the paratextual framing of the translated versions. I'll take front covers as an example. These are the front covers of the 2 paperback editions of Northern Girls in English. One is published in 2012, the other in 2016. And we can see that in the 2012 edition, besides the right background, the main image is a landscape consisting of a row of skyscrapers. It's an overview of a modernized city, obviously. And this visual element demonstrates the novel's theme of life in a Chinese metropolis with no indication of gender issues. As for the 2016 edition, we can see that the skyscrapers are still the major part of the cover here. And there is an addition of images of several female sandals. The whole cover demonstrates that this novel is about women's lives in a big city. Although different in terms of gender indication, these two front covers highlight the modernization and urbanization process of contemporary China. Comparatively, we can see alternative frames of the story on the book covers of the Russian, Czech, and Polish translations. There are prints of high heels here and clear images of young women. And this is quite obvious an Oriental young woman. And apparently the gender aspect of this novel and the female identity are highlighted in these covers. And there's no image relating to Chinese society or modernization. Now I'd like to move on to the translation strategies of the English version. Although it's a feminist writing, the author utilizes misogynist discourse in this novel to present a narrative irony towards patriarchal values as accusations towards the cultural system that marginalizes subaltern women. And in the English translation, this aspect is downplayed to a great extent. Here are some examples. Sorry. So the first example presents a man's resentful attitude towards the female protagonist, which devalues her through derogatory slang and highlights their disparities in the socioeconomic sense. And comparatively, this sentence is omitted in the target test. And the next example, women are really meddlesome, is rendered into a woman's life is never easy, which removes a gender stereotype of women and replaces it with the hardship of women's lives. And it creates a different meaning from the author's writing and a contrast actually. And actually there are a lot of alterations and omissions in the English translations that fall in this category. So we can see that the translator tended to omit or rewrite the misogynist discourse, presenting the image of women in a more positive way. And the misogynist plate of rural migrant women is attenuated in the target test. As a result, the narrative irony and gender rhetoricity are downplayed. And in this novel, the subject-making journey of rural migrant women is marked by how they live through multiple power relations, as mentioned earlier. And these power relations actually marginalize and exploit them in different aspects. Here are some examples of this kind of narrative. So we can see that in the Chinese, 不太好控制, not easy to control. It is a verb phrase. It is a transitivity system in the verb phrase that demonstrates an evident power relation in which the male character, Li Mazi, as the actor of control, dominates this action process, while the female character is effected object in a passive position. And comparatively, the translator deletes this transitivity system and replaces it with an independent streak as a characterization of the female character, which downplays this power relation and points out the active female agency of being independent. So we can see the translation strategy here is omitting the transitivity system that denotes an equal gender power relation and underlining the independent female agency. And besides gender power relations, this novel also demonstrates other social forces that exploit rural migrant women, such as the state power and transnational capitalism. For example,
in the interruption, you have 3 more minutes left.
Okay, thanks for reminding. For example, in this source test, working like a robot in the jail, 在囚牢里机器人一样干活, indicates the harsh working conditions when the female character works in the factory, pointing out how female migrant workers are exploited as production machines and routinized labors. However, this figurative expression of the female experience in the factory is omitted in the target test. So in this way, the power relation and torturous reality in the industrial workplace are downplayed, and the female subject as a victim of labor exploitation is not reproduced. And in this novel, rural migrant women are constructed not only as marginalized objects in the patriarchal context, but also as female subjects with agency and autonomy as part of the characterization. And this aspect is also rendered differently in the target test. And in this conversation, we can see the female character's expression of men is supplemented as men to choose from. And this addition of action actually constructs the subject position of the female character. And in this alternative discursive framework, the female subaltern is no longer depicted as a stereotype of a poor girl, passively waiting for man's good graces, but as an active agent who chooses for the happiness. So the translation strategy here is amplifying the female subjectivity. And based on the analysis above, a conclusion could be drawn. Firstly, multiple agents have involved in the transnational circulation of the literary discourse of Chinese female subaltern, including commercial, academic, literary, and political ones. And the front covers of the English versions present Northern Girls as a realistic account of Chinese modernizing progress, while the Russian, Czech, and Polish version highlight the female subaltern identity. And the translation strategies of the English version are in line with Western feminist ideology, which tends to remove misogyny, downplay the oppressed and passive position of subaltern women, and highlight the female subjectivity. In the English translation, the multiple power relations in contemporary China that construct the female subaltern subject, such as gender power relations and power relation in the factory and in society, are rearranged. And the discourse of Chinese gender subalternity is simplified to some extent. So that's all I'd like to cover today. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. This is another interesting topic, particularly when you show me those front covers. It reminds me of Bushra's research because I used the infographics, right, to create a picture inside the reader's mind. Looks like we have people coming into this room. That's awesome. Before I want to see if before I ask my question, I want to see if other people have any questions here. Let me check to see here. Okay, while we are waiting, because this is my actually question I have encountered myself. This is also related to one of the Dr. Qian's presentation yesterday. He's trying to translate Chinese Communist Party's documentations into English for Western readers. And undoubtedly, the final translation, if you want to make sense to the Western readers, will be very, very different from the original text. So my question for you too is, I just want to hear what your thoughts on this one. Now, do you think the translated version of the Northern Girls, how different are they from the original one?
Yeah, so according to the translation strategies I have shown, we can see that it's like a feminist translation, because the strategies that the translator, and maybe also there are some editorial decisions, the editors maybe also change some things, and it's in line with feminist ideology, but that may not due to the translator's explicit feminist ideology. I mean, maybe she is not, she wanted to make this decision to flaunt her feminist stand. And maybe, I think maybe it's just, like you said, when the Chinese discourse is imported in the Western context, maybe the translator just need to comply with the times, with the discourse in the West, such as how Western people can perceive women. And maybe like she reads the Northern Girls in the novel, like they are living in such a misogynist environment, and men like exploit them sexually, socially, economically. And they think that this is not what women should be like in Western countries. So I think if, because I haven't conducted any interviews with the translators, I'm not sure whether it's her feminist standpoint or it's just she trying to perceive women as what it should be perceived in the West. So that's just like the So her standpoint is, I think it is to comply with the target culture. But other translators may think that I should present it as it is in the source culture. That's so-called fidelity and equivalence. So obviously the translator or the translators and editors intervene in the text in this case study. And yes, some feminist interventions. Yeah.
Maybe that's a mission impossible after all, because
Yeah.
you are the images will never be the same.
Yeah.
So that's why we are discussing transcreation, transmutation, adaptation in this session. Thank you so much for your explanation. I like it. I like it a lot.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, let me see if we have, I'm not able to see Blin. Sometimes they have questions from there too, but see here. Okay, Bushra has a question. Can you read it?
Oh, yeah. Reminder of Orientalism and its impact on the Western perception of the Orient from their findings, and you came across repetitive patterns in other translations which align intended representation of women in general. Yes, actually, based on some previous research, there is a tendency of simplifying. Because I was focusing on women's literature, actually there was a tendency of simplifying Chinese women, and like I said, the multiple power relations, the misogynist environment, they are all removed. That's a process of simplification. So I think that's something like Orientalism. And it's like, because and Western people, how Western people perceive Chinese women, they are inevitably stereotyped. And these translations actually further stereotype Chinese women, because yes, they are either like some object people that are under in some dark environment, either they should change themselves to comply with the Western discourse. So they are never themselves, actually. They are what Western discourse perceive them. So that, I think that's Orientalism, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Yijia, did I say your name right?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for this impressive presentation. Due to time limit, we have to move on to the third presenter. This is a pre-recorded video, and our host, Jiayu, will play it for us. And the presenter, might not be able to come here to answer questions in person. So if you have any questions, I will put down my email address there. So if you have any questions for her, I will make sure I forward your question to her. Okay. Jiayu, are you on this? Okay, can everyone hear me? Hear my the presentation? Okay. Can you all hear the presentation? Okay, hold on. Okay, hold on. Bear with me. Jiayu, let's do this one more time. Okay, I will share the screen on my end one more time. I think, sorry for the noise, it's my dog. She's bored. Jiayu, can you hear me? I will play it on my end now, because I just want to make sure we don't play it at the same time on both ends. Jiayu. Okay, you will play. Okay, you will. Let me exit. Okay. Okay, sorry guys. The quality is not the most ideal one. I apologize for that.
My topic is writing on Escapa's back translation in Lola. The display animation is on the ballet of Lola. I will introduce it for following four aspects. Firstly, overview. Okay, so the ballet of Molan. Molan is a traditional military ballet of Molan from Yue point and has been approached in Chinese mind for a long time, in which the typical characteristics of Molan is both a street woman and an ordinary person, a hairy and a countryside girl, a vigorous rebel and a dedicated daughter of her dad. She is industrious, kind-hearted, determined, brave, and lazy. Also, she loves her relatives. She is loyal to serve her country. Then, K2, Mulan is the on the basis of that, it shapes a bold and brave woman who dresses like a man to fight against a ferocious and savage battle in the stereotype of Chinese people. The prevalence has been impressed for a long time only on the words, but the facial impression of Mulan is opposed from the Disney animation with carved willow eyeballs and phoenix eyes, dressing in high full hair, which lasts to date. When it comes to Testamen's back translation, as for Testamen's back translation, it only has gone through a short journey from wordless back translation based on the analysis of moments in Peking by returning into the revised Tesla-less back translation, which is not ruthless, but is Testament with culture. It refers to Chinese culture. However, Tesla-less back translation is derived from back translation, referring a process in which a text which has been translated into a given language is retranslated into source language. It had also been called a foreign language recreation in 2020 by Hong Wang and his doctoral students. Until 2015, system had been cleared and confirmed and classified three sorts of writers and four types of texts. Then, Chambali and Qingning too further into four types of writers and specified them by various literature works of domestic overseas Chinese, foreigners of Chinese origin, and other foreign writers. Then, we know the Enlightenment. Such a writing view on a Tesla-less back translation may not only pave the way for Asian books and records with the excellent Chinese traditional culture to share with other countries to promote cultural diversity, but also make this marginalized perspective globalized gradually. Okay, there are some relevant studies. Among relevant studies on this series of films, the correct most academics mainly focus on female image and representation, such as the female individual and the empire, a historian's approach to Mulan and Canstone's woman wears, but also a large number of studies on the different culture between Disney and China's Mulan, such as Mulan Legend and the Legacy in China and the United States. Also, the recent one is Mulan's travel from ballet to movie, a case study of intermodal translation. Part 2, questions. This paper, we will know the writing classification and the reasons for writings, and how the ideology and the politics interplay with each other. And part 3 is the methodology. We will classify the writing into 3 types. Firstly, image. Secondly, interjection. Thirdly, music. We will use the basic theory from the book by Edward Liebenberg, Translation, Writing, and the Manipulation of Literary Theme. As a perspective, writing is proposed by Liebenberg, who suggests that all writings, whatever their intention, reflect a certain ideology and politics. Also, it mentions the patronage, ideology, and politics. You can say from the PPT. Then, part 4 is analysis. Firstly, we can know the image provided about Mulan's father. You can see the picture on the PPT. We know her father is called Fa Zhou, is required a man to serve in the imperial army for the Fa family. He puts down the walking stick to his wife and straightens his back to accept it with his leg, which symbolizes the contributions to the countries. In Ballad of Mulan only talks about the reasons for acceptation, but not introduce father's seriously. Also, in order to show father's strong heart and love for his daughter, more pictures that Mulan's father educates and touches her warmly with all his love appear in the films. Which never occur in the original poem to show the family's great relations. Okay, and then into second image, Mulan's friend, Bushra. Who is it? Bushra adapts to the Western culture by something which is a characteristic in Disney and animated films to attract people's attention. Bushra is not majestic, dignified, and aggressive, but is cute, friendly, and lovely to protect and make some suggestions for the family and Mulan in the army. Okay, in common sense, the animated film discloses the sense of humor by some impersonated enemy, such as the Lion King, Zoot Pig, and Kung Fu Panda. More intimacy of motion, figure, more adaptation of dragon, and so on. Also, we know the man who is the captain of the army, Li Shang. The writing on Li Shang emphasizes discipline and strengthening the military army to fight against the Han army rebellion. Also, there are some other pictures of Mulan's friends to overstate the man's behavior. The second one, interjection. She don't change her interjections and even revise it from English to Chinese. Also, we can see the yeah. These are the interjections in Chinese, not from English. But some other interjections, such as where, we know where is okay, and yeah is right. They are revised from the English version to the back translation in Chinese. So we can see the screen and hearing translation. It may also be the multimodal translation by the similarities. This offers another angle to examine the text-based back translation within the framework of multimodality. Interjection is a mode expression and term meant that some of them have entitled in language like books, wall, and in English, but others may be only heard between communication and exchange in the interview. So, domestication and foreignization are combined to stimulate the interjection that can be tested with back translation in Chinese orders. The third one is music. We know early in Walt's late career, he realized the ability of music to advise his work. There's a very big power to music, he said. You can run any of these pictures and they've been dragging and falling, but the minute you put music behind them, they have life and vitality. You don't get any other way. This picture is about the first fragment comes into the cleaning up and making up to help the singer song to identify the aim, bringing the owner of our family by being selected in the palace and shaped more than as a girl with good taste, calm and obedient with good breeding, and attending voice. So this music forms adaptation, more expression and dialogue is no longer dull and monotonous.
Family tree, keep my family Family tree, keep my father standing tall.
So, to the fourth part of the case analysis, listen for about writing. We know the patronage, the reason for the text-based back translation of the above writing part and is then gradually the physical patronage, Disney, and even the invisible patronage American crown for this kind of music. Ideology and politics. In communities, ideology refers to be limited within the political spectrum, but ideology was seen to be that framework of firm conviction and belief which order our actions. we know the patronage leverage the important role in these varieties. It is one of the core of founding in movie. It is clear that some of them are Asian American and even Chinese Americans with similar tone or stress to represent Chinese characters. Such a convenient one who is a Chinese American served more than 5 in 1998 and is selected as one of the 50 beauties around the world by people. Thus, some intersections of Mulan can be explained by her identity. Okay, and another Asian American actors of Hollywood discovered Mulan's father and made a beautiful match with Mulan. Shen's voice is represented by Bi Wan, who is also a Chinese American, has acted in many famous movies, and he is only one of the members of Oscar in 2013 distinctive achievement. Countries plays a dominating role in Mulan first and Mulan second, with an idea of pursuing heroism promoted by the Americans. It's a free and independent country, having a large migration population to pursue more freedom. In the history of America, most people take themselves into consideration firstly, and then their friends and parents around them. By contrast, Chinese tend to be collectivists. That is one of the basic and significant morals in China. Then come to ideology, the politics. Obviously, the politics is closely connected to ideology. Influence the generated by ideology forces in the environment of the literature system. Individual heroism belongs to the political ideology, playing the instruction role in the plot rewriting and the character writings in the movies rather than from the aspect of collectivism. Music, the characteristic of the business city, penetrates the human politics. The primary role for small movies obey by its music thread concentrates on various plots and dynamic tempos brings into audience heart and leaves the right symbols to sing along with it. Scientific politics is only derived by the business city, influencing the cultural ideology in the movies. It will come to the last part, conclusion. The measure, testing aspect translation and perspective may be utilized here widely to close to the central part of translation studies of the different languages in literature. Of course, on the basis of the revised theory, this paper may provide more flexible and wide means to think about translation for this perspective for each country who intended to exchange and introduce their national classic literature to the world, which may also promote the cultural diversity across the world. Okay, thank you for your listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your time. And this is our last presentation, and the presenter, Ye Minyin, is a postgraduate student at the School of Foreign Studies at Guangxi University for Nationalities in China. She's dedicated to video and audio translation. And if you have any questions for her, please, I put my email just here in the chat box. If you have any question for her, you can email it to me first, and I will make sure I forward your question to her. And I think that's all for today's presentation in session 6. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all the presenters for the wonderful presentations. And I will see you after the break. Thank you so much.